This is discussion 1B, part B of discussion 1 for History 111 from Northland College for 8/31/20. So last time I talked about the question of why did agriculture develop in here and not there, and also why did it develop into a civilization here and not there. Today I want to take a look at, in this second part of the discussion, I want to look at a different question because there's a biologist named Jared Diamond who came out with a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And he looks at this question of why here and not there, and he has a lot of things that are really interesting and really important and really good to know, but he's not entirely right. And I want to talk about, what problems there are with his thesis. But first I want to give you his thesis. So Diamond begins, he says, if you look at Francisco Pizarro conquering the Inca Empire in 1533, he says, several hundred Europeans, a couple hundred Europeans show up, and they actually wind up conquering the Inca Empire, which has millions of people in it, and was a highly developed civilization with social hierarchies, a centralized government, all sorts, all this. How did they do it? And so Diamond starts from the present and says what in the past allowed the present to happen, which is not a bad way to go about history. But Diamond, being a biologist, he says, well, if you look at how the Europeans won, they won because they had guns, germs, and steel. They had guns. The Incas didn't, neither did the Aztecs, but that's not the point here. They had steel. The Incas didn't. So they had swords and they had body armor that was steel, etc. And they had germs. And one thing that is usually not mentioned is that the Inca Empire had just been ravaged by a smallpox epidemic that Europeans had introduced to the Americas, but had gotten to the Inca Empire before the Europeans did. And so, the massive death rate from smallpox had wiped out, we don't know, but maybe half of the population. And then it had killed the emperor, and this has caused a civil war. And so the Incas had actually been fighting a civil war for quite a while, that had just ended when Pizarro shows up. So the Inca Empire was really weakened because of germs, right? And Diamond points out that, if you look at the Native American population when Columbus arrived in 1492, and you look at the Native American population about 100 years later in 1600, 90% of the Native American population has died or disappeared. Right? Some of that was natural death, but they weren't replaced. But the reason for that is that epidemic diseases introduced by the Europeans had just spread like wildfire through the Americas and had wiped out 90% of the Native American population. Right? Or had caused a decline of 90% in the Native American population. So Diamond says, well, why did the Europeans have all the cool guns and all the cool steel and all the cool germs? He also mentions one other thing, which is that Europeans had horses and the Incas didn't. And that was a crucial thing also because the horses were sort of terrifying, especially in a battle. And so he says, well, why did the Europeans have guns and germs and steel and horses and the Incas didn't? Right? And the Aztecs didn't. And Diamond's argument is that you really have to go back a long ways. He says that this was actually set up at the beginning of human history because he says the reason they had guns and steel was that they had been a settled agricultural society for longer than the Incas or the Aztecs. Remember in the last discussion I pointed out this gap of several thousand years. So Europeans and Asians and Africans had a 3,000 to 4,000 year head start in developing their technologies once they became a sedentary agricultural society, right? And I talked about how in the Neolithic Revolution, once you settle down, then you get a bunch of technological innovations like writing and pottery and metallurgy, etc. So Diamond basically says the guns and the steel were the result of having had this 3,000 or 4,000 year head start. He also says the germs and the horses came from something else. He says the germs and the horses came from the fact that Europeans had and Asians and Africans had a long history of animal husbandry. They had domesticated large animals a long time ago. And that's why they had horses, because they domesticated horses thousands of years earlier. But also that's why they had the diseases. Because Diamond points out that many of the diseases that affect human beings actually caught from their livestock. Right? And so the fact that Europeans and Asians and Africans had domesticated large mammals, pigs, horses, sheep, cows, goats, long time earlier, but the Incas had only domesticated the llama and alpaca, and the Aztecs had only domesticated things like turkeys and guinea pigs, meant that the people in Eurasia, the old world, Eurasia and Africa, had been swimming in a sea of diseases for millennia and had developed partial immunity, meaning they got sick from mumps and measles and whatever, but they didn't die from it very often. Whereas in the Americas, without those large domesticated animals, those diseases were never there, and the Native American populations in the Americas simply didn't have any disease resistance to most of the diseases that were just commonplace in Africa, Europe, and Asia. And so when those diseases showed up, when measles shows up in the New World, it has like a 90% death rate, right? Because Native Americans, their immune systems had never encountered this before. They had no way to fight it. And so the net result, Diamond says, is that the fact that Europeans had horses and other large domesticated animals meant that they also had diseases. And so when they showed up in the Americas, they had both the advantage of the horses, but also the advantage of the diseases that killed Native Americans but didn't kill Europeans or Asians or Africans in such numbers. And so Diamond's overall point is that his argument is that, in fact, the victory of the Europeans over the Aztecs and Incas in the 1500s had been set up thousands of years earlier when when the Fertile Crescent had developed agriculture and domesticated animals, and then that had spread to Europe. And so Europe had this thousands of year head start on the Americas, both in terms of crop domestication, which means they had longer time to develop sedentary society and technological innovations and whatever, but also they had this huge head start in what kind of animals they had. And so Diamond says, well, why was that? Why did Europeans and Asians and Africans have this huge head start over the Americas? Well, here's where Diamond is really interesting. He says basically there are two keys. He says when you ask why did Europeans or Asians or Africans, why did the Fertile Crescent invent agriculture first, he says the first thing you have to ask is what do you have to work with, right? He says there are only certain plants that are domesticatable, right? There's really no point in trying to domesticate elm trees because there's nothing we can really eat out of elm trees. Right? And so Diamond says there are about 200,000 plant species in the world. But he says only 12 of those species are really central to human food. And those 12 species account for 80% of food production for human beings today. So just 12 species, that's 80% of human food production. And those 12 species, by the way, are wheat, corn, rice, barley, sorghum, soybeans, potatoes, manioc, which is what you make tapioca out of, sweet potatoes, sugar cane, sugar beets, and bananas. 80% of our calories come from those 12 species. So Diamond says, if you want to develop a great civilization, remember I talked about those packages, you have to have a good package of carbohydrate, protein, and fat. He says if you want to develop a stable civilization, you need to have that good package, and you don't just need to have a good package, and you can only have a good package if you've got plants to work with that are good for domestication. So basically, you want one of those 12 types of plants to be wild where you are, because if they're not there, you can't domesticate them, right? And so Diamond looks at plant domestication. He says, well, if you really look closely, it's a really tricky thing. It really depends on what you have in your area. For instance, if you look at corn, which I talked about in the first half of this discussion, it was bred by human beings to go from teosinte, which is this tiny little thing which is barely edible, and they bred it to produce these huge kernels and these huge cobs. But that took thousands of years to domesticate teosinte into something that you could really use as the foundation for human food. And so basically the Americans trying to domesticate teosinte, it took them an extra couple thousand years just to domesticate it. Whereas in the Fertile Crescent, they had several forms of wheat already that they just had to domesticate, and that didn't take long, right? Maybe even just several generations, a decade or two, right? And so the candidates you have can have a huge impact. Well, Diamond makes an interesting point. He says if you look at which, if you look at those 12 crops I just talked about, the big ones, wheat, barley, oats, etc., they're grasses, right? They grow as grasses. They grow on a single stalk. They grow every year. They spread seeds, and then they die. He says grasses are really one of the best forms of complex carbohydrates for human beings, or rice also. But those often grow best, or at least they grow wild, in what's called a Mediterranean climate, which is the climate around the Mediterranean, but also Southern California or South Africa or parts of South America have Mediterranean climates. And essentially, and there's some parts of Australia that have it too, Mediterranean climates have a long dry season in the summer where it doesn't rain much at all, but then they have this rainy season in the winter. And essentially these grasses, they germinate right after the rainy season and they grow like crazy. And then they die off and go dormant. They spread their seeds and die off, and then the seeds lie dormant until the next rainy season. So really, if you're looking at what parts of the world are going to have the best plant candidates for domestication, you're really looking at Mediterranean climates, right? And that's much less than the rest of the world, right? I mean, most of the world is not a Mediterranean climate. So Diamond says, well, okay, let's just look at Mediterranean climates. Clearly, the Mediterranean is right there for the Fertile Crescent, so that helps explain why the Fertile Crescent developed agriculture. But why didn't South Africa develop agriculture? They have a Mediterranean climate. Why didn't Australia? Why wasn't Australia in on the ground floor? They have a Mediterranean climate in certain regions of Australia. And why wasn't California, which has a Mediterranean climate, why isn't that a cradle of civilization, right? Well, the answer, Diamond says, is that cereal grain candidates are not equally spread out over Mediterranean climates. Some of them just have more, just naturally, that's just how it evolved. He says if you look, there are about 56 wild grasses that would be candidates for domestication by human beings, meaning they've got a pretty big seed in a seed pod, they grow fast annually, et cetera, et cetera. He says there's 56 candidate species that might be good to domesticate. He says 32 of those 56 are in the Fertile Crescent wild, meaning people growing in the hunters and gatherers in the Fertile Crescent, if they started looking for cereal grain grasses to domesticate, they have 32 options to try, right? Well, then you say, okay, what about the rest of the world? Well, Chile in South America has a Mediterranean climate in one section. They have 2 candidates. So hunters and gatherers in Chile, they have the same climate, but they've only got 2 candidates to work with, not 32, right? And then if you look at South Africa and California, they each just have 1 candidate, which is close, right? And for each candidate, I mean, candidates just mean they're a grass that has a pretty big seed, but that doesn't mean that they might be poisonous, right? It might have a husk on so hard that we can't get into it. There are lots of reasons candidates don't work. We basically, as human beings, we had 56 candidates to choose from, and we've only domesticated 5 or 6 of them, right? 5 or 6 grasses: oats, wheat, barley, rye, etc. Right? So there's a lot of reasons a candidate might not work out. So if you've only got 1 candidate in California or South Africa, and that one doesn't work out, you're screwed, right? There's no way you can domesticate a cereal grain. And Australia, which has a Mediterranean climate, has 0 candidates, right? So Diamond says that basically the Fertile Crescent won the lottery there. They've got 32 grass species that might be domesticatable, and they can try all of them and just see which ones they can make work, right? And so when you look at the places that agriculture developed, they often have a couple of really good candidates, right? Rice in China, taro root in New Guinea, sweet potato in Southeast Asia, manioc in Africa. And so if you happen to have one of these candidates, you have a pretty good chance of developing agriculture early on. But if you don't have one of those candidates, you don't, right? A similar process with animal domestication, right? I mean, for human beings to domesticate animals is really a tricky thing. You have to have a really good candidate. And for one thing, it's got to be something that's going to produce a fair amount of food per animal, right? I mean, humans domesticated the guinea pig for food, but it's really not that satisfying to eat guinea pigs. You need a whole lot of them. No, they do breed fast, but you generally want something larger, right? And so a large mammal, horses, pigs, cows, sheep, goats, those are going to provide a whole lot more food per animal. And so you want a fairly large animal. Now, there's some other things though, right? We have not domesticated grizzly bears. They're a large animal. There's a lot of meat on a grizzly bear. Those suckers weigh 1,100 pounds. But the problem is there's also a lot of teeth and claws in a grizzly bear, right? And so we generally do not domesticate, dogs and cats accepted, we generally don't domesticate predators. And the reason for that is that they're often, especially large predators, because they're just too hard to handle, right? You don't domesticate tigers because they're just too dangerous, especially for people living in the Neolithic age, right? Okay, now we're going to look at basically, actually omnivores, right? Usually omnivores, animals that are largely, vegetarian is great, herbivores is great, but we can go with omnivores like. We could domesticate things like dogs, which eat all sorts of things. But you don't want these huge apex predators that are really big and dangerous. But then you look at other candidates, you say, okay, so we want large animals, right, that eat grass or what have you. But there's a lot of other reasons that animals might not be good candidates. One is they have to be able to reproduce in captivity if you're going to domesticate them, right? And so, for instance, one of the problems with, say, cheetahs, suppose you wanted to, I know they have lots of claws and things, but one of the reasons that cheetahs were not really domesticated is that they are too hard to breed in captivity, right? Cheetahs only breed when a female goes into heat. She's willing to then have sex with a male. But female cheetahs only go into heat when they have been chased by a male cheetah for something like 80 miles over several days, right? That is hard for Neolithic people to sort of handle, right? And so cheetahs are simply unbreedable with using Neolithic technologies, right? But then there's also the issue of what if the animal takes too long to breed, right? We've never domesticated elephants. Now we have tamed elephants, but we've generally not domesticated elephants. And the reason is that elephants, the gestation period for a pregnant elephant is like 2.5 years. And they breed too slowly, and so it's much easier to simply leave them in the wild and catch one once in a while if you want to use it, than it is to actually try to breed them, right? And so elephants are out, even though they've got a lot of meat on them, they're out because they breed too slowly, right? And there are other reasons too that an animal might not work with. There are certain types of gazelle that would be great, they're a good food source, they eat plants, they're not that dangerous, but when you put them in a cage, their natural instinct is to bash their head against the wall to try to get through the fence, and they generally kill themselves, right? So, okay, how are you going to domesticate that one, right? And then other gazelles can leap 20-foot fences, so why on earth, how are you as a Neolithic farmer going to domesticate that one, right? So there's all sorts of problems with different animals, all sorts of ways that an animal can prove to be undomesticatable. But of course, just like with plants, you want to have a large number of candidates in order to ensure that some candidates will fall away because they have some disqualifying characteristic. You want to wind up with 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 good candidates that don't have any disqualifying characteristics, and then you can domesticate them. So just like with the plants, let's look at where the animals are. Right? Well, there's a couple things going on here. One is if according to Jared Diamond, there are 148 omnivorous mammals in the world that could be called candidates for domestication. They're big, they're omnivorous, they're not apex predators, etc. But only 14 of those have ever been domesticated. All right, so only 14 large mammals have been domesticated. Now, Diamond is setting aside chickens and turkeys and things like that. So we're only talking mammals here. So there's 148 large omnivorous mammals. Only 14 have been domesticated. Let's look at where the candidates were spread out, right? When human beings started out, where were the good candidates, right? Well, Eurasia, which is Europe and Asia together, since it's one central solid landmass, had 72 of the 148 candidates, about half of them, okay? Africa had 51 of the candidates, about a third of them. Right? And there's some overlap here because there are some animals that are in both Africa and Eurasia, et cetera. The Americas, North and South America, had 24 of the candidates. Right? So they're down to an eighth of the candidates, or a sixth rather. Oh, I'm sorry. Whatever. And Australia had one. Has one, the kangaroo. But basically, in the lottery, Eurasia wins, right? Africa's a close second, and the Americas and Australia are just not doing it, right? And so you might ask why. Well, Diamond points out one thing that's huge here, which is that when human beings showed up in Australia and in the Americas, there were a lot more candidates than there are now. And the reason for that is that we're pretty sure that about 40,000 years ago in Australia, which is right about when human beings showed up, there was a massive wave of extinctions of large animals. Right? Australia used to have giant kangaroos, which are like 10 feet tall, and giant sloths and woolly mammoths. I mean, no, I'm sorry, not woolly mammoths in Australia, but they had giant wombats and things like that, and they died out. Now, there could be a couple of reasons for this, right? It could be, I mean, the sort of first answer people go to is that human beings, these are animals that had evolved without human beings around, and then human beings all of a sudden show up, and the animals have no intrinsic fear of human beings, so you can basically hunt them by walking up to them and sticking a spear in them. And so human beings just ate so many of them that it caused a population crash. That's a possibility. The second one is that human beings brought some sort of virus that spread like wildfire and caused all the animals to die off. Not the human's fault, but they caused it. A third option, and we don't know which of these options is true, is that the human beings showed up in the first place because of climate change, right? I mentioned before that human beings got to Australia because the sea levels were really low because it was an ice age and the glaciers had locked up a lot of the water. Well, perhaps some sort of climate change was occurring when human beings arrived, and that climate change was helping to wipe out all the animals. And it could be all three. It could be that human beings inadvertently introduced a virus or something. It could be that climate change was already stressing the animal populations, and then human hunting further stressed them, and they went extinct. But whatever the case is, by the time human beings got established in Australia, most of the large animal candidates were gone. Right? Similar thing happened in the Americas. That by about 13,000, we're sure human beings were in the Americas by about 13,000 years ago. And we see massive die-offs of woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and all sorts of large animals right about that time period. Now again, it might be climate change, right? And climate change could be stressing them out, and it might be human hunting, or it could be a virus or something like that. But we do know that a lot of animals went extinct right about when humans showed up. In Clovis, New Mexico, which is one of the earliest places, the place we have some of the earliest evidence of human beings existing, right about and we're pretty precise on when human beings showed up in Clovis, New Mexico, but right about when they showed up, two extinctions, which are pretty precisely dated, of large, like mountain goats, basically sheep, went extinct in that area of New Mexico right about when human beings show up, right? So it's an open question what caused it. Did human beings overhunt? Did climate change do them in? Did some sort of disease do them in? Was it something else we haven't thought of? Or was it all of those acting at once and the animals couldn't handle all of it? Who knows? But we do know that in the Americas then, just like in Australia, significant numbers of large mammals died out right when humans showed up, so they didn't have them around for domestication later, right? So, and ultimately, if you look at the Americas, we had bison, which are large and potential candidates for domestication, and we have some deer. Now in South America you have llamas and alpacas, which humans did domesticate, and we domesticated turkeys and guinea pigs and other sort of smaller mammals, but as foundational animals, they just simply didn't have it. So Diamond's argument, and I think it's a persuasive one, is that agriculture started here or there because of agriculture developed into sedentary agricultural societies here or there because of the natural environment, that in certain places there were simply lots of candidates for plant domestication and lots of candidates for animal domestication, and that gave places like the Fertile Crescent or China an enormous advantage, which they then used. And I don't think I mentioned it, but I just want to mention, in the Fertile Crescent, wild animals, wild forebears of the horse, the pig, the cow, the sheep, and the goat, and the camel were all around there, right? So the Fertile Crescent just hit the jackpot, right? They had 32 candidates of grasses that they could work with, and they had all the major domesticated animals there, right? China had the pig, and Central Asia has horses and all sorts of things, muskox and et cetera. There's just lots of candidates. And so Diamond's argument is that agricultural, and in particular sedentary agricultural societies, developed in Eurasia, the Fertile Crescent, China, et cetera, and then in Africa, thousands of years earlier than the Americas and Australia, because they had readily domesticatable plants and readily domesticatable animals there in much larger numbers. So it was just an easier thing to do. They won the evolutionary lottery. And so and I think this is a persuasive argument. I think this really is a good argument for why agriculture, at least one reason why agricultural societies developed first in places like China and the Fertile Crescent. All right. There's one other thing, though. I keep talking about, Diamond is talking about Europe, right? Why did the Spanish conquer the Aztecs and the Incas? But I've never mentioned Europe as a place that agriculture developed, right? It developed in the Fertile Crescent. Well, there's one other thing Diamond points out, and that is that if you look at a map of the world, right? And I'm not even gonna try to draw a map of the world, but suppose you draw a map of the world. You've got Eurasia up here, right? You've got Europe over here and China over here, and you've got Africa down here, right? And then you've got North America and South America over here, and you got Australia way off to the side. Diamond makes an interesting point. He says, if you look at the agriculture in Eurasia, it's a very small number of species of wheat and rice that spread over the whole continent, right? The Europeans are using the same kind of wheat that Indians are and northern Chinese are. And so, and Diamond points out that that's partly because of this is just a weird thing, the shape of the continents. He says if you look at North America and South America, they're largely oriented in north-south. Right? It's a much longer distance from the southern tip of South America to the northern tip of North America than it is across North or South America anywhere. They are essentially long and skinny. And Africa is similar. It's much longer from top to bottom than it is from side to side. But Asia is a different thing. Asia is essentially horizontally wide and not as tall. And obviously this drawing doesn't show how tall it actually is. But Diamond makes an interesting point about this, which is that if you want to take a crop, a form of wheat or rye or rice or something, and you want to move it to another area and plant it, you have to move it to a place with a similar climate, right? It has to have roughly the same growing seasons, otherwise it's not going to work, right? You can't take rice and move it up into a really temperate zone and expect it to grow the same. It's just not going to. You can't take manioc, which is a tropical plant, and plant it in Wisconsin, right? But Diamond says, what's interesting is continents that are north and south, they have a lot of climate zones because climate varies based on your latitude, north and south, not your longitude, east and west. Now, climate there are lots of things like mountain ranges and water, rainfall, and et cetera that shape climate. But basically, it's much easier to spread crops all the way across Eurasia from Spain to China because they have roughly a temperate climate all the way across than it is to spread crops from North Africa to South Africa because they have Mediterranean climate up here, desert in the middle, tropical climate there, and then Mediterranean climate down here, right? So you might have a Mediterranean crop up here, but it can't naturally spread down there because it can't be grown in these middle regions, right? And so it would have to jump, which requires travel, which is not happening. And similarly with North and South America, you can develop the potato in Peru, but the potato is it grows up in the Andes Mountains. It's a temperate plant, and it's not going to spread through Central America, which is tropical, to get up to North America, which is temperate again. It would work up here, but getting there is a problem because there's so many different climates between. So Diamond makes an interesting point that Eurasia has one more advantage, meaning it's horizontal, which means it's easier to spread agriculture all the way across Eurasia than it is in North and South America, et cetera. And so because of that, there's less borrowing between groups in North and South America compared to Eurasia, and even in Africa compared to Eurasia. And so he says that's an advantage also, right? So in all of this, I think Jared Diamond makes some really interesting points about the development of human civilizations and why it happened here and not there, right? But I don't think Jared Diamond is entirely correct. And the simple reason, I'm going to phrase it slightly differently. I think he does explain to a certain extent why the Spanish had such an advantage when they arrived in the Inca Empire. The guns, the germs, the steel, the horses, those really were a great advantage. But Diamond makes it sound like this was all set, 6,000 BC, by 6,000 BC or something, when, or even 8,000 BC, when the Fertile Crescent has domesticated the 5 major animals and several types of wheat and barley. He makes it sound like it's just determined after that. It's going to happen. But Diamond really doesn't address, and he can't explain, why didn't China conquer the Americas? Right? Because China had developed actually complex societies before Europe. China invented agriculture on its own. They had the complete package, and they're developing cities, and they're one of the earliest civilizations. Europe is actually kind of lagging. Why didn't China do it first? Right? And the answer is there's all sorts of other things going on. There's culture, and there's wars, and there's conquests, and there's economic differences, there's trade, all sorts of things that Diamond sort of glosses over also shaped how these things develop. So Diamond has one important thing to say, which is that the number of domesticatable plants you have and the number of domesticatable animals you have and the ease of spread have a huge impact on whether a society remains basically hunting and gathering, whether it develops agriculture but not complex civilizations, and then whether it develops complex civilizations. He's great, but he does not have the complete answer because he cannot explain. He's jumping over a whole lot of history that explains in more detail why this place and not that place did the conquering, because both of them had the ecological advantages, but only one of them did the conquering, and that's because of culture and all the history that happened in between, which is what we're going to study in this course.